Hey, we just found out that the camera cuts off after 20 minutes, so this will be part two of what I get to share with you. So I was saying, we have the same mission and different strengths. One of our strengths is camping. One of the things that we don't do, that churches are much stronger at, is sacraments, and a lot of things that Young Life will never do. We don't baptize kids in Young Life. We don't take communion. Like, those are things that we believe that any young believer should be doing those things as a part of the body, but we don't believe that's with Young Life. We believe that that should be with a local church. A good principle in this is we're building the kingdom. We're not building our thing. So when I show up at the high school or at a Young Life event, I don't think about building Young Life. And when I serve at church, I don't think about building the United Methodist Church that I go to. Instead, all of it is building the kingdom of God. And so it's easy to have a partnership, a kind of camaraderie when we realize that we're building the kingdom and not our thing. One note on that, something that I learned earlier this year is that we ought to be developing followers and not a following. What I mean by that is we're focusing on the people that God has put in front of us and growing them in faith with Jesus. What we're not doing is trying to make Young Life the biggest youth group in the county, or for a church to make their youth group the biggest in the county. That competitiveness doesn't serve the gospel mission. Instead, coming back around, like, we're trying to build the kingdom, not our thing. We're trying to develop followers, not a following. So I'll share a couple of examples of the relationship that we've gotten, or that I've gotten with some pastors here in Newberry. The first one that I want to talk about is the relationship that I have with the pastor of the church that we go to. He moved here about the same time I did, about 4 years ago. He's from Mount Horeb, and I think that you guys have a speaker who's going to share with you guys from Mount Horeb in Lexington. But we moved here about the same time, and so I got his number, and we went out to lunch. We got to know each other. Found out he was a runner, and so we spent some time running together. We did some races together, and we've continued that relationship all the way through. Now, Tori and I, we didn't immediately go to his church. We actually ventured out and tried a lot of different churches when we moved here, and we ended up at that one. But it was fortunate to already have that friendship with the pastor there. And here's one thing that I would say too. I'm going to talk more about this in a second, but it's going to take a while, wherever you end up, for you to find the church that you want to be a part of. And then once you join it, once you start going there, it's going to take a while after that too for it to feel like home. You're going to feel like a stranger for a stretch. Another relationship I wanted to talk about was my relationship with a youth pastor, the First Baptist of Newberry youth pastor. His name is Corey. And I met Corey at an FCA at the high school. He is involved with FCA to meet and support the students that go to his youth group. And I use FCA as a way to meet new kids at the high school. It's an excuse for me to be on campus and in their world. And so the first one I went to, I met Corey there, and we struck up a friendship. And so one of the things that I'm intentional to do, again, I hope you hear that word intentional, I take the initiative both meeting with Pastor Brian and with Corey. One of the things that I'm intentional to do with Corey is on the Mondays that we have FCA, I make sure that I text him and ask him if he wants to carpool. And sometimes I forget, but more often than not, we ride to and from FCA together. And so we have that whole car ride just to get to talk. And it's about a 15-minute car ride one way. And so every time we go to FCA together, I get to hear about how his wife Melody is doing, how his daughter Anna Grace is. We share victories and struggles from ministry. We talk about the books that we're reading. And so here's the bottom line. In order to have a good working relationship between the church and Parachurch Ministries, you've got to have friendships at the personal level, probably at the leadership levels between the two. And so if you work for a Parachurch ministry at some point in the future, I would say the onus is on you Like, church leaders aren't going out of their way to try and connect with parachurch organizations. In fact, parachurch organizations should be trying to go out of their way to connect kids to, or any new believer, to a local church. And so I would just say the onus is on you if you're a parachurch worker. It's your responsibility to be intentional and initiate there. The best thing you can do for a church as a parachurch worker is to build a missional community that outsiders will want to be a part of. And that's true the other way. The best thing you can do as a church is to build a missional community that outsiders want to be a part of. And so when both of those areas become magnetic, and what I mean by that is they're drawing in people, then at some point they're going to overlap. And when they do, it's going to be like when two droplets of water come together, all of a sudden the growth is going to be significant there. And so just build a missional community that outsiders want to be a part of. Here's question number 5, if you have the sheet in front of you. If you don't, that doesn't mean anything to you. It says, how can a parachurch worker maintain a close tie with his or her local church? To what extent should the parachurch worker have a ministry of some sort within the local church? What are the keys to the working relationship between the church worker and the parachurch worker and church staff? Here's the first thing I would say here. This is true of any believer, but I think it's especially true if you work for a parachurch organization. Church is a must. It's not optional, it's mandatory. Every Sunday morning, unless you're out of town or very sick or have a family emergency or something, you need to be in church. You need to belong to a local church body. And I've heard people before talk about wanting to take a break from the institution of church because of this problem or that problem or the politics or things like that. And I would respond to that by saying it is important that you have a spiritual community that you're seeing Monday through Saturday and not just on Sundays. But God designed the church. When He thought of the church, He knew that politics and personalities and logistical problems would arise. And for 2,000 years, He has been using those things to grow and sanctify His people. And there's things that you can do when you belong to a local church that you can't do if you just have Christian friends. For example, you're probably not tithing or supporting other ministries as a group with your friends. That's something that churches get to do together. You probably don't have any form of church discipline among your friend group. So for a number of reasons, I'm saying church is a must. If you're a parachurch worker especially, you must go there. Here's the point. Trust is earned. Trust is earned. And if you want to have good relationships with church leaders or people in the community or parents of kids you're trying to minister to, then you've got to be a trusted figure within a local church body. This question talked a little bit about the extent that a parachurch worker should be serving in a local church. Here's what I've learned in my experience. You can't do both to the best of your ability. Now, don't hear me say pick one or the other, because I think that's a false dichotomy. What I am saying is when I came and worked here in Newberry, I got an offer more than once to be a youth pastor. And because I've done Young Life before in an area where I led at 2 different schools, and while I was at CIU, I led Young Life and also served at church, I realized that if I said yes to that invitation to be a youth pastor, it wouldn't be overseeing one group of kids and whatever ideal scenario that you can think of where they would overlap. Inevitably, it's going to be you overseeing 2 groups, 2 communities, and that's difficult to do. So I think there's a level of leadership that you've got to say no to in the church if you are a parachurch worker in order to do your job effectively. That being said, you need to be serving the church somewhere. So I said church is mandatory. I think other things that are mandatory is you need to be serving somewhere, whether that's on the worship team, whether that's doing the sound or the audio. Maybe you set up tables and chairs and tear them down, or serve in the nursery or something like that. You need to be serving on a weekly basis in church. Maybe you have a week off every now and then, but you need to be serving. You need to belong to a small group, whether that's Sunday school or a Bible study. If you just show up to church on Sunday mornings and then you leave, you haven't really been a part of a community. You've been a part of a program. And I would say for myself and for Tori, it took us several months to decide what church we wanted to go to when we moved here to Newberry. And then once we decided that we would go to this specific church, it probably took us another 6 to 8 months before we felt like insiders. Every week we would show up and we'd feel like outsiders again. And that was with us going to Sunday school, going to church, having personal relationships with the leadership. So a lot of people will quit going to church or will jump from church to church because they aren't willing to go through that season of getting to know people and letting people get to know you. And so I would say whenever you decide where you want to go, stick there, and that's how you're going to earn trust. Here's another thing. This is a practical. Eat together regularly. So I mentioned earlier Pastor Brian, like not only do we race together, but I initiate frequently with him to go out to eat and to talk about ministry, both Young Life and at our church. And every Sunday after church, in fact, we go out to eat with a group of friends or students or parents or other people on the worship team or the sound team. It was one of Jesus' favorite ways of building community. He was always eating with people. And so we ought to use that tool too. And if you're a foodie like me, you're welcome. You'll enjoy it. So some practical benefits that we get as a parachurch organization from our relationship with the church. The number one is we get financial support from both individuals and sometimes from churches as a whole. And as a nonprofit, we are 100% donor funded. And so it is vitally important that we have people in our area who are financially supporting the mission. And a lot of those relationships started because we stayed and belonged to a church, and we've earned the trust of not only our church's leadership, but other churches in the area as well. Another benefit is that we've been allowed to use available space at churches for events. And we're in a small town. It can be difficult to find a space that fits 100 or 200 people for our larger events, especially one that's free. And because we're responsible and they trust us and we clean up after ourselves, there are churches that have let us use their space for free, and it is such a gift to us. So I'll move on to number 6. This question asks, what are some advantages of parachurch roles as opposed to church staff roles? What are the challenges that they may not present, but a church staff role would? So here's one thing I would say. If God's calling you to the church, that is a high and mighty calling. And I think one of the sins that we have in parachurch organizations is a lot of the time we might look down on the church. And that's not right. If God's calling you that is a high and honorable calling. In fact, Jesus said that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. And he was not talking about Young Life or FCA. He was talking about the bodies of believers that form the universal church. And so I chose to work with Young Life because I figured there are more people doing a great job in churches, and I wanted to be part of the mission movement reaching people outside of churches. And most of the churches I've been a part of didn't do missions as well as Young Life did in their area. And so that's the reason that I chose to work with Young Life. And some of the advantages that I've gotten to experience by working with Young Life, I wouldn't say these are true of every parachurch organization, but they're certainly true for us, is I've received better training and better resources than a lot of my friends that went into church work. For example, I have monthly meetings where I'm continually trained by supervisors from outside of my area who've been doing this longer than I have. And every year I get to take a seminary level course. For the first 5 years it's totally free. It's actually expected of me. I'm required to do those. And then after that, because I work for Young Life, those courses are half price. And so if you end up working in an organization or a church that does not have those sorts of training and resources built in, I would say that's an important conversation to have with the leadership there of how can I continue to grow and what are ways that this group or this church will invest in me and help me become better at doing what God has called me to do. Also, another advantage with Young Life is that I get access to schools and kids and organizations in a way that some churches struggle to do. And I think that's just mainly because of the separation between church and state. For example, you might have FCA at your high school, but it might have been uncommon for a youth pastor to just show up in the lunchroom. And that's because oftentimes schools will trust nonprofits more than they will trust local churches. And I know some of that might not be a trust issue, some of it might be a liability issue, but that's an advantage we have in Young Life. I can get in places that oftentimes are difficult for churches to get into and reach kids that oftentimes it's difficult for churches to reach. There are some challenges to working for Young Life and for a parachurch organization. Inevitably, if you work for a nonprofit, you end up wearing more hats. For example, most churches, even really tiny ones, will have an administrator and a head pastor. Maybe they have a youth pastor too, or a nursery worker. In my area here in Newberry County, I am the chief fundraiser, I am the head executive, I'm the recruiter, the trainer. So you have to wear a lot more hats, and a lot of that means that you've got to be good at learning. You've got to be willing to say, I don't know, please help me. And you've got to build a team around you that is good at the things that you're not, because you're going to be expected to do a lot more things than maybe a church worker that has other people there around them would be expected to do. So let's see. This is question number 8. How does a full-time Christian worker strive to maintain a balance between his ministry duties and his role as a husband or dad or mom? So I don't have any kids. I can't really speak to parenting a ton, but I have been married for almost 3.5 years now. I think over 3.5 years. And so I can speak to that a little bit. First of all, hopefully, I remember in my time at CIU this was true. Hopefully you've already heard that it is more important for you to be a spiritual leader to your family than it is for you to be a spiritual leader to anyone else. And what I mean by that is that God has called you before you ever go out to make disciples to be someone who loves your wife or loves your husband or loves your kids with godly love. And so if you are not doing that well, then you are not you're not going to be the type of Christian worker that God desires. And so some of the ways that Tori and I have figured out how to maintain that balance is open communication. Here's a line, guys and girls, that you should tattoo on your brain. Uncommunicated expectations lead to frustrations. So you need to talk about all of these things in order to have a great working understanding of what each person expects. And I'll give you an example of what that meant for me and for Tori.